Hello there. I am Amber Telford, a second-year genetic counseling student and 17-year veteran firefighter in Plymouth, Massachusetts. I hold a bachelor's degree in biology from Bridgewater State University with minors in anthropology and biochemistry. In recent years, there has been increasing conversation and research on cancer in the fire service, including the classification by the IARC as carcinogenic to humans in 2022, in addition to the investigation of the effects of PFAS and flame retardants in turnout gear. My committee consists of Susan Capasso, Laura Moreno, Christine Candler, and Jeffrey Burgess, and my capstone project is called Increased Cancer Risk Among Members of the Fire Service and Carcinogens in Firefighter Turnout Gear, Transport, Storage, and Laundering Habits. Susan Capasso is the Assistant Program Director of the Bay Path University Genetic Counseling Program, holds a doctorate of education, has worked as a U.S. public health officer in research at the National Institutes of Health, and has been a practicing genetic counselor for over 30 years. Laura Moreno holds a master's degree in public health with a concentration in genetic counseling, has had multiple publications in the Journal of Genetic Counseling, and has been practicing as a genetic counselor for several years. Dr. Christine Candler has been a doctor of dermatology for 23 years and dedicates her time to dermatological scans for firefighters around Massachusetts on a volunteer basis. Dr. Jeffrey Burgess has been involved in researching cancer in the fire service for 30 years, spoken at several conferences, and has established the Firefighter Cancer Cohort Study, which is a FEMA-funded research project that provides a national framework to collect firefighter epidemiological surveys, biomarkers, and exposure data focused on carcinogenic exposures and health effects. Also want to give an acknowledgement to Anna Young from Harvard Chan School of Public Health, who helped me with some feedback in my paper. Thank you very much. I chose this topic in honor of Anthony Colarusso, who served on the Plymouth Fire Department from 2006 to 2015. Tony was a great human, a great firefighter, and a friend to all. He was diagnosed with esophageal cancer at age 38 and passed away at age 39. He is beloved by all who worked with him, and he will live on in our memory. This presentation will expand upon the known increased cancer incidence and mortality in the fire service as compared to the general population, and review that turnout gear contains carcinogenic compounds when both used and new. My study wanted to assess the possibility that turnout gear exposure both to firefighters and their family members could be an area of concern. My study used a survey in order to gather data on transport, storage, and laundering practices. I will talk about the relevant results, including analysis and meaning, and then the implications and conclusions for my findings. Up here to the right, the upper right, is a landmark study done by Daniels et al., funded by the CDC. That was the first one to really solidify the increased incidence and mortality of cancer in the fire service. The Google Forms survey I created asked how often firefighters transport their gear in their personal vehicles, store it in their home, and where they launder their gear. The survey was deployed using social media, text messages, and by hanging flyers with QR codes in fire stations in Eastern Massachusetts. People in fire stations were chosen by accessibility to the author or me, by geographical location, or through networking with contacts from the military and fire academy. The quantitative data gathered in the survey was analyzed using descriptive statistics, and open-ended survey questions were coded using thematic analysis. The research reached 84 members of the fire service working in Massachusetts. The municipalities represented include Plymouth, Weymouth, Melrose, Kingston, Boston, Wakefield, Lowell, Lancaster, Brockton, Falmouth, and Sandwich. All were career or full-time firefighters, and none had ever been diagnosed with cancer, but all were at least somewhat aware of the cancer risk in firefighting. Other demographics are shown here in Table 1. And here is a quick graphic I made to describe the various ways people reported that they became aware of the increased cancer risk in the fire service. And the nitty-gritty of my research was to get a sense of how often transporting takes place in personal vehicles, which infers potential contact with upholstery in the vehicle, contamination of air if the vehicle is closed up, or skin contact by other family members. No one surveyed said never. Answers varied by city, rank, reason, and all other demographics. 38.1% reported gear was always or sometimes kept in the passenger's compartment. And of those, 59.4% report that it is not contained. For all respondents, about half said they do not contain fire gear when they transport it. 19 out of 84 fell into the always keep gear in the passenger's compartment group, and of them, 14 said it is not contained. 5 of the people who keep it inside the cab uncontained say they transport their gear 4 times per week or more. So almost 6% transport their gear often in the cab uncontained. If that amount of firefighters nationwide were extrapolated, there could be a significant amount of exposure there. Also keeping in mind that Massachusetts has pretty good awareness of the cancer risk and good awareness of the forever chemicals and turnout gear. And that probably compared to a lot of other states and areas in the country, we are ahead of the game in this. So 6% may actually be more in many other places in the US. The results indicated that the practice of storing gear in the home was uncommon, with about 90% saying they never or rarely do this. Only one respondent reported that they keep their turnout gear in the living quarters when they bring it home. From table 5 in the survey, the vast majority said they wash their turnout gear at least a couple times a year, with only 10.7% saying maybe only once a year. Everyone polled said they wash it at the fire station or use a laundry service. The results indicated a high level of cancer awareness, and although the practice of transporting gear is common, still 60% reported that they never or rarely transport gear in the passenger's compartment of their vehicle, limiting the chance of exposure via off-gassing, skin absorption, or hand-to-mouth contact. 93% never include their bedding or clothing in with turnout gear, and overall home storage and laundering habits indicated low potential for exposure. Everyone who responded to the survey transport their gear on some level. This included all ranks, reasons, and municipalities, as mentioned, though some cities reported lower frequencies. Since cancer incidence and mortality is higher in the fire service, and it is established that gear contains carcinogens, the results do show a pathway for exposure to both firefighters in their off time and to their family members. Because I'm in genetic counseling school and we often deal with increased cancer risk, I decided to relate this back to how this has implications in genetic counseling. And that is the fact that we know about 70% of all cancer diagnoses are considered sporadic, meaning not having a genetic component, certainly that we know of yet, and sporadic relates to being from the environmental exposures or aging, or just sort of by chance. These exposures, the exposures though that are endured in the occupation of firefighting, as evidenced by the IARC, which is funded by the World Health Organization, they designated the occupation as carcinogenic to humans in 2022. So that means there is a likelihood that the population of firefighters will probably be referred to genetic counseling clinics more often in the near future. Although genetic counselors usually deal with hereditary cancer mutations, sometimes getting cancer at a young age, under 50, is a good reason to refer somebody to genetic counseling to see if they have a germline mutation. But I can imagine that if this trend keeps up with cancer in the fire service, more and more firefighters will be recommended to genetic counseling sessions to talk about whether or not they have a germline mutation. Awareness of this designation by the IARC and increased risk could also be an important consideration for risk assessment in a genetic counseling session, especially if a patient also does have a cancer susceptibility due to a germline mutation. For example, if a firefighter has Lynch syndrome, which is a mutation in one of 2 genes that are associated with an increased risk of colorectal cancer, and that person's still on the job, they may be even more susceptible to a cancer diagnosis at a younger age if they have both things going on. Also, the information of environmental exposures on the job could be included in a genetic counseling session in the personal or medical history, the way smoking or alcohol use is factored in. Last, genetic counselors could play an important role in testing if and when analyzing circulating tumor DNA becomes more reliable and mainstream. Firefighters living in cities with fewer fire stations may transport their gear in their vehicles less often. For example, the majority of firefighters from the city of Melrose, which has 3 fire stations, responded that they transport their gear very rarely. None of these respondents stated that they transport their gear more than once per week. One possible conclusion is that firefighters living in cities with fewer fire stations may need to transport their gear less often. Also, the main reason respondents say they do not bring their gear in the passenger's compartment is that they keep it in the bed of their truck. So regarding home storage, one reported storing it in their living quarters, and both of these point to the possibility that logistical realities may factor in to possible exposures. For example, simply not owning a truck or living in a studio apartment may be things that are, forcing certain people to keep their gear in closer quarters with them. 4 respondents have children who were diagnosed with cancer, autism, autoimmune disorders, or congenital changes at birth. 2 of those described that their gear was always kept in the passenger's compartment. Results from this study can be used as a gateway for further research to investigate if there is a relationship between gear exposure and childhood cancer, autism, autoimmune disorders, and congenital changes. Turnout gear exposure may not confer the highest level of suspicion in contributing to elevated cancer risk, but vigilance in hygiene practices is a worthwhile direction, similar to cultural movements that encourage the use of self-contained breathing apparatus at all fire scenes. One limitation of the study was that the context and extent of exposure was not probed. Another limitation is that the healthy worker effect, which is a selection bias that makes it unlikely that persons affected with cancer will still be on the job, and thereby they would not be reached by this study. More research is needed to quantify the risk posed by turnout gear exposure. This study was limited by sample size and was restricted to representation of policies and practices in only 11 Massachusetts municipalities. Larger studies evaluating transport, storage, and laundering habits that include rural, wildland, and volunteer firefighters should be undertaken. In January 2023, the IAFF announced it had retained 3 nationally organized tort law firms to assist the union in its effort to end firefighter cancer and remove PFAS from use in the fire service. So future research will include finding alternative fabrics to use in protective gear instead of PFAS. In conclusion, the respondents of this study indicated low-risk home storage and laundering habits, but transport habits could be improved upon. Firefighters would benefit from even more heightened awareness around off-gassing, family member exposure, and the presence of flame retardants and forever chemicals in all gear. And more detailed NFPA guidance on gear transport would be beneficial. At this time, the NFPA guidelines note best practices to keep the turnout gear safe and free from deterioration, but clarification on best practices to limit third-hand exposures could be helpful. This would be an attempt to limit skin contact and decreased ingestion of live fire chemicals that evaporate from gear, resulting in less carcinogenic exposure for firefighters and their family members. Here is a quick thank you to my committee members for their support in this project. Also, a big thank you to Plymouth Fire Chief Neil Foley for his support. Those that helped me distribute the survey, Lieutenant Chris Rooney, Captain Gary Walsh, and Captain Chris Dillon. And thank you so much to all the members of various fire departments for filling out my survey.